Okay, so it looks like we're recording, and I want to welcome our panelists and the folks who are going to hopefully be listening to this. And so, as some of you guys may know, today on October 10th, the Fifth Circuit held oral arguments for the case on DACA. So this is a really big moment for the DACA litigation as we move forward. And so we're going to have Kristin and Jessica kind of talk through a little bit about what is DACA, what are the implications of this case? What are the implications of if DACA ends? And maybe other nuances that DACA recipients may want to know about. So, with that, I will pass it off to Kristin to introduce herself.
Thanks, Priscilla. Yes, Kristin Etter here with Texas Immigration Law Council. I'm the Director of Policy and Legal Services. And we all listened to the oral arguments this morning and have a lot to say. But before we get into it, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Jessica for her introduction.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Priscilla. So happy to join you all. My name is Jessica Cisneros. I'm the managing attorney with Texas Immigration Law Council. I also heard the oral argument this morning. I think we have a lot of updates to give folks about what this could potentially mean, especially on how this could affect DACA beneficiaries. So I'm excited to get into it.
Thank you, Kristin. Thank you, Jessica. And before we get started on actual DACA stuff, originally the Fifth Circuit was also set to hear arguments on a parole in place, otherwise known as keeping families together. So can you tell us a little bit about why we didn't, what happened, and just basics of what we need to know why we didn't hear anything about that case today?
Yeah, I can go ahead and answer that question. So here at Texas Immigration Law Council, I mean, we've been doing a lot of education around keeping families together, the parole in place program that was announced this summer, that unfortunately was tied up in litigation a few weeks ago. It's been very fast tracked. There's been a lot of updates. Things are constantly changing. Originally, as you mentioned, Priscilla, it was scheduled for a hearing this morning along with the DACA hearing. But last week on Friday, we got an update that the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals basically summarily affirmed the district court order denying a motion that was supposed to the hearing was supposed to be to hear arguments for that. So because the Fifth Circuit made a decision on that, it canceled the hearing. So there wasn't a hearing this morning on keeping families together, but I do anticipate that we're going to have updates pretty soon because the court did the district court did issue a new scheduling order, and there's a possible bench trial and a hearing on other motions for November 5th, which is election day. So it seems like we're going to have a really busy November. So we'll keep y'all updated on that. But I mean, the basic answer is just there was no hearing this morning. Stay tuned.
Gotcha. And that's really helpful for us to know that I think a lot of us are going to be watching the news and really anticipating election day results on November 5th. And so now I just know that a few of us are also going to be keeping an eye and an ear out for this case on keeping families together or parole in place. So thank you so much, Jessica.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention on that though, because I know folks have questions about, well, what does this even mean, right? For like I'm thinking of applying for parole in place or already applied. What's happening with my application? It's still the same. The administrative order is still in effect. That means that the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services can receive your application, but it cannot make a decision on it. So if you are interested in applying, you can just know that as of right now, there's not going to be a decision on your case.
Yes, and I think it's worth noting that you will still have to pay the application fee if you apply now, but depending on whatever outcome in the court is, we don't know if you will get your money back. So also keep that in consideration for folks because the application fee is around $560-ish. So keep that in mind if you decide that applying is the right step for you and your family. So next, we're going to go ahead and move on to DACA. So can either of you just explain maybe the basics of the program? So like, what is the history of it? What kind of community was it meant to impact? And what were the benefits that it really sought out to create?
Yeah, thanks, Priscilla. I can go ahead and jump in on that. So, DACA is a concept that really kind of predated the initial policy. So, we go back to 2001, and there was the legislation was filed called the DREAM Act. And really, the impetus behind the DREAM Act was to be able to provide some type of relief for children who were brought here, undocumented children who were brought here by their parents. And when President Obama was elected, he tried several attempts to get the DREAM Act passed in Congress, and that failed. As a result, in 2012, President Obama initiated this executive action called DACA. It stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And I guess let me step back and talk a little bit about what deferred action is, because deferred action is a really important tool that our government has and has been widely used throughout history. So 2012 was not the first time that a deferred action program was used. It's been used throughout the last several decades to essentially provide certain individuals relief from deportation. So, for each person here without status, the executive has a decision to decide whether or not to pursue removal at all of a certain either individual or group of individuals. And deferred action is essentially the ability of the executive to provide discretionary relief from deportation or removal to allow a particular person or a group to stay in the country. And so, again, this is a long-standing tradition that has gone through different administrations of both political parties. And it is something that is very well established in law that provides the executive the ability to do that. So in 2012, when President Obama decided to expand this deferred action program to include children from undocumented children from parents that had come here, he's essentially expanding those protections. And there were certain criteria that had to be met. So the criteria of the original DACA program required that the child be under the age 16 or under, and that they had to have come with a parent prior to June 15th of 2012. So if they were 16 or under and brought by that date, and if there were a couple other criteria, obviously they couldn't have had significant criminal history or security threat. But essentially under the DACA program, President Obama decided to protect those individuals from removal, as well as confer benefits, allowing them to apply for work authorization. So that really was the essence of the DACA program. It was widely popular at the time of the initial enactment of this executive order. And again, these DACA recipients could apply. They had to pass a background check. They had to, certain criteria met, including the criteria I just discussed. They had to pay application fees. And if they were then eligible for DACA, they were given 2-year renewable work permits and protection from deportation, although they were not ever offered, nor have they ever been offered a pathway to citizenship. So that in a nutshell is DACA. And we've had it in effect since 2012, although it was paused in 2021 as a result of this litigation. And again, DACA has been tied up for years, but it was in 2021 that the district court in the Southern District of Texas implemented a final rule, essentially stating that DACA was not lawful, and that individuals who had applied and received DACA prior to July 16th of 2021 could be eligible to continue to renew their DACA 2-year work authorization programs and would be provided relief from deportation, but would not be able to accept new applicants after that date.
Gotcha. So let me just ask a clarifying question, because you just mentioned this at the end that DACA has not been able to receive new applications, right? So people have been able to renew if they had already been granted that protection, DACA, but new potentially eligible individuals have not been able to receive any protections under DACA. Is that correct?
That's correct. So as of the date of July 16th of 2021, there were approximately 600,000 individuals that received DACA. And so that is, and because we have not been able to accept new applications since the July 16th, 2021 date, that number has remained 600,000. But of course, as you can imagine, of that 600,000 that have been here for lawfully for more than a decade at this point, many of those individuals have gone on to open businesses, go to school, have families, and we'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of some of the arguments that were made today and how devastating it would be to remove those protections from individuals, so 600,000 individuals, as well as approximately 250,000 U.S. citizen children of DACA recipients.
Gotcha. And so the state of Texas brought on this lawsuit. And so let's talk a little bit about what interest does the state of Texas believe that it's protecting in bringing this lawsuit against DACA? So I know that was mentioned a little bit in some of the oral arguments today, but if you can maybe just give us a recap as to what does Texas think that they're protecting in their state's interest in bringing this lawsuit?
So, what Texas's essential argument is, and the reason that they believe they, as long as as well as several other states that decided to join in this lawsuit, have standing to bring this lawsuit, they are making a claim that Texas spends tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars annually to provide emergency Medicaid services to, and in their words, they use the term illegal aliens through social services, healthcare, and education costs. They made the argument that this increase in spending is traceable to DACA recipients because it encourages, in their briefing, they allege, it encourages 100,000 aliens who would otherwise be legally required to leave to remain in Texas. So they essentially say that the state of Texas is harmed by having DACA recipients reside in the state of Texas because of the increase in spending on social services, as well as healthcare costs, administrative costs, in terms of placing additional burdens, for example, on state agencies who are handling driver's license applications and other legal documentation. In addition, they've made an argument that DACA recipients are competing with native-born workers and lower wages to other native-born workers in Texas. So that's essentially the argument in a nutshell, and one that I should say did not seem very persuasive this morning at the Fifth Circuit.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And so now having heard of what Texas is essentially using as the basis for their lawsuit and their arguments, how did the federal government and the other defendants respond to these allegations or concerns that Texas has?
The other parties in the lawsuit, notably the federal government, as well as the lawyer for the interveners, the DACA recipients, and the state of New Jersey, completely refute the entire premise of Texas's argument that having undocumented people, first of all, they aren't able to attribute any of the expenses to DACA recipients in and of themselves. So I think, there's just no way that Texas is able to aggregate numbers. But even if they were, I think the best argument that was made is that rather than DACA recipients costing states money, the benefits that DACA recipients bring to the state of Texas and to the state of New Jersey, and really to our entire country, far outweigh whatever de minimis costs that they might have to the state. And so just for example, if DACA ends, it would be a $648 billion loss to the economy. Not only that, but $150 billion in revenue to state governments. In addition, ending DACA would cause almost 600,000 people to lose jobs, livelihoods, as well as healthcare coverage. It would also cause them to be unable to pay back loans, education. It would also cause them to lose in terms of housing. So it could create a really devastating impact on our housing, on housing by having people forcibly be removed from their homes. It would also put at risk close to 86,000 United States citizen workers who are employed by DACA recipients. So a high percentage of DACA recipients are actually business owners. So not only are they employees across our country and in the state of Texas that employers rely very heavily on, but they're also employers in and of themselves because they are business owners. And so DACA does not pose an economic harm to any state. Rather, and this was really the essence of the New Jersey, the New Jersey lawyer, in essence, DACA recipients actually, the benefits and the economic revenue far outweigh any costs associated. And so when you look at how the differing arguments, not only just the economic arguments, but one of the lawyers for the interveners talked about the reliance, and so did the Department of Homeland Security federal attorney as well, talked about the reliance. So what you have here is you have close to 600,000 people who have relied on the protections that DACA has afforded them for almost a decade. So not only have those DACA recipients invested in our communities, started families in our communities, opened businesses in our communities, joined the armed services, and really just did everything to structure their entire lives and livelihoods on the granting of DACA, because they've relied on that for close to a decade. So part of the argument there was that reliance that DACA recipients and now their families, including the 250,000 US citizen children that rely on their parents for protection and for parental support, all of that would go away if DACA was to go away. And so not only would our economy be completely impacted in a very negative way, businesses would close, homes would be foreclosed on, children would be left without parents, and you basically strip the billions of dollars of tax revenue that governments at the local, state, and federal government receive from these DACA recipients. But again, you then destroy families, you destroy livelihoods, and you destroy people that we have been protecting for 10 years. You destroy everything that they have built up over the last 10 years. And so because the recipients of DACA have relied on the DACA protections, in essence, the lawyers opposing Texas have stated that it would be unlawful, essentially, because even if the government were to say that they can't have more DACA applications, it would essentially be illegal because of the reliance doctrine to strip away those protections to the approximately 600,000 people that have been protected for the last more than 10 years.
Gotcha. That's really helpful to think about. And I think even in the greater or in the smaller context of Texas, I should say, right, is that like Texas has so many medical deserts, for example, right? Like I know Jessica and I are from the South Texas border where there is a medical desert. Texas is also in a teacher shortage, right? There's also not enough people that are filling jobs in STEM that we need, right? And so according to the Coalition for the American Dream, there's so many of these DACA recipients that are working in these fields, right? Like I believe the numbers is around 37,000 are working in healthcare profession jobs, 17,000 are in education, and then another 17,000 are in science, technology, engineering, math, so STEM fields, right? And so what's going to happen to the innovation and our school systems and our healthcare systems if these DACA recipients lose their status, right? I think that's really important for us to consider. And so thank you, Kristin. You kind of jumped a little ahead, but that's okay. I think that's a really important context for us to recognize, right? Is that because DACA has been in place for 12 years now, these individuals who have had DACA for these past 12 years have made major strides in integrating into our country, right? They were already integrated before, but working in underground economies, always under the fear of deportation. And now they've really been able to settle and make their homes here, right? More permanently in a more permanent basis. So I think it's important to remember that context. So with that being said, my next question is going to be, so this has been a long case, right? DACA has been challenged and re-challenged, and we've been in kind of this back and forth for a really long time on this case. So tell me a little bit, like, where are we procedurally in this case right now? Like, what does that mean after today's hearing? What's the next step, sort of thing?
So I think the important thing to know is that today was just a hearing. There hasn't been any decision as of yet. I know usually the question that we get is like, okay, so when is the Court of Appeals or the District Court or whomever is having this hearing, when are they going to issue a decision? The reality is that we don't know. But on average, the Fifth Circuit, where the case is right now, it usually takes about 6 weeks or so. So we could get a decision right around the holidays. We could get it before. We can get it next year. We don't know. Um, but after we do, we'll know whether there's going to be a nationwide injunction that was issued, that if that's going to remain. This was the case that, or the injunction that Kristen brought up earlier, where Judge Hainan from the Federal District Court down in Brownsville allowed will basically put a stop to the new DACA applications and only allowed the renewals to go forward. So that injunction could possibly stay until there is a hearing on the full merits of the case. Most importantly, we'll know where the next stage for the fight to continue on this case, whether it will be up in the Supreme Court or if it's going to be down, if the case is remanded down to the district court in Brownsville again. But again, just want to stress that there is no decision as of right now. So just make sure to stay tuned. Visit our website, txilc.org for any updates. I mentioned earlier also about the Parole in Place program and any updates. We routinely put those there. This podcast is going to be there. We're going to add additional information as we receive it. So just stay plugged in. And again, we don't know what the next stage is going to happen. We don't know when there's going to be a decision, but we are letting folks know that as soon as we have this information, we're going to be disseminating it. But obviously, I mean, it is scary, right, for DACA recipients who have this, who are unsure what their future in this country is going to look like. So one thing that we do as attorneys is, prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So we do have some recommendations for folks and just some resources, but we can talk about that in a bit. The other thing I just wanted to stress is that whenever there is a decision, a lot of the arguments that we heard today was about standing, right? Whether Texas has been injured enough to be able to present a case or have this case heard against DACA. The reason why I bring that up is because we were talking about the parole in place litigation. There's also a litigation around the parole program with the Chinba countries, which is Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. Other kinds of discretionary, immigration programs could also be vulnerable depending on what this court rules. So if you are a beneficiary of any of the other programs, it's important for you to stay up to date so that you know what could potentially happen in regards to your immigration status.
Gotcha. And so let me rewind to a little bit as to what you were saying before. So all of again, this has been a very long case going on for spanning multiple years, right? But you mentioned something of like full merits hasn't necessarily happened yet. This is kind of still on the preliminary injunction. So did I understand that correctly? So all of this time that we have been litigating DACA up until now hasn't even necessarily been on the full program. Is that correct?
It's mostly been procedural kinds of issues, even under past administrations. Most of it has failed because of procedural issues. And here, today's question was mostly whether Texas had standing to move forward with this case. And then the other issue was also severability, right? Like if there is an injunction, should it only affect Texas or should it affect the entire nation as a whole? So those were the two things that the judges seemed interested in discussing with the lawyers today.
Gotcha. And so what does that mean, severability? Severability for Texas or nationwide? I know that was brought up a lot in the hearing, but can you explain a little bit about what that means for folks who may not fully grasp that idea or understanding?
Yeah, sure. I can take that one on. So, the issue of severability is whether or not the entire DACA protections in total. So, DACA really has two parts to it, and you heard the lawyers talk a little bit about the forbearance part and the benefits part. So, the forbearance part of DACA is really just forbearance or preventing removal, preventing deportation, having relief from deportation, and just being able to live your life without fear of being deported. The benefits aspect of DACA is the 2-year work authorizations that can be indefinitely renewed at this point, right? If you've been given DACA prior to July 16th of 2021. And so the two main benefits of DACA are the forbearance and benefits portion of DACA, but there's also this other component of DACA, which requires people to submit all of their information to the federal government, to the Department of Homeland Security. So there was a question as to whether or not if some part of DACA is ruled unconstitutional or illegal, could another part of it still remain? And so there was this argument by the attorney for the Department of Homeland Security that basically made the argument that even if you were to find the program as it relates to forbearance and benefits unlawful, there's still this element of the registry of people's names, sensitive information to the federal government that could remain. And then, of course, the executive would have priority whether or not to remove those people. The attorney for the intervener did not, on behalf of the DACA recipients, made a different argument. However, she said, and this was Maldef Nina Perales, basically said, no, if you were to take away the forbearance, which is relief from deportation, and the benefits, which is the 2-year work authorization, then that's just getting rid of DACA altogether. And so there was a little bit of a differing argument when it came to that. And then as far as the nationwide injunction, Texas is making the argument that even though I think it's 22 other states that are very clear about we want DACA recipients living in our state. They help our economy, they help our communities. We don't want to get rid of them. Texas is the only one that even tried to make this economic injury argument. There were no other states that even would attempt to make that argument. And so the issue is whether Texas alone, because they're claiming that they're injured by having to pay these costs that they've alleged, which have not been, that they've done nothing to actually tie them to DACA recipients, by the way. So the other states that value immigrants in their state, that value the economic contributions that are made by immigrants and DACA recipients in particular, which is an argument was centered on today, those other states, including the lawyer for New Jersey, have essentially said, just because Texas is claiming this very tenuous and unsubstantiated injury, economic injury to having approximately 100,000 DACA recipients in its state, other states should not have their ability to have immigrants and to benefit from immigrants in their states, including DACA recipients, be taken away and be removed. Those other states value the economic contributions. Again, New Jersey, for example, they have statistics stating that DACA recipients in the state of New Jersey contribute an estimated $18.7 million just in income tax alone. And in New Jersey's briefing, they actually say that in total, states and local governments across the country could lose 1.25 billion with a B in tax revenue each year if DACA was to be removed. And that is, again, that is just of the current recipients, the approximately 600,000 individuals. Imagine how much better our economies would be had that program not stopped in 2021. Imagine the 1.25 billion that we receive nationally and collectively because of those 600,000 DACA recipients. Imagine if we had 1 million more DACA recipients. Imagine if that program hadn't been terminated in 2021. and how much more our economies could have grown, how many more healthcare workers, armed services members, teachers, business owners, and employees we could have in our country. And so, really, if you take New Jersey and the other 22, approximately 22 states that don't want to see DACA go away, they don't want the state of Texas making a decision for them. They don't want the state of Texas taking away their valued members of their community and economic contributors into their community. So that was the issue, whether or not the nationwide injunction, whether it should just be Texas. And I should say, if Texas alone is the only state that decides they want to kick out DACA recipients, I can imagine that other states would applaud and welcome them with open arms into their states, because we know how valuable they are, not just as people. I mean, I think DACA is a true and shining example of what lawful pathways do. If you look, or if you know a DACA recipient, if you work with a DACA recipient, if you have a family member of a DACA recipient, it is so incredible to see how DACA recipients have really taken advantage of the program and gone on to get advanced degrees, gone on to become nurses, doctors, join the armed services, opened up businesses. And so I'm sure the other states would welcome them with open arms. And it would be a real loss to Texas and to Texans.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think the state of Texas has always, and especially in more recent years, kind of been like this beacon of business, right? As welcoming to businesses. But I think going back to some of the numbers that you said before, right? It's like if DACA goes away, we are going to be impacting Texas businesses of employees who are employed by DACA owned businesses, right? And so that I think is going to be a really dramatic change to Texas's economy, and something that Texas, if they go through with this, right, would really have to make up for in lost revenue, um, and lost GDP, et cetera, right? And they would have to make up in other ways, right? I think, which is one of the arguments that some of the attorneys made on the hearing today, right, is that via the loss of DACA, they're going to have increased expenses in like Medicaid, because even the US citizen children of DACA recipients are going to lose their health care, right? These children could potentially even face family separation if their DACA parent gets deported, right? And then they remain in the United States. So there's a lot of really, I think, harms that could be secondary consequences if DACA ends, right? If DACA goes away. So I think with that being said, let's shift now and focus a little bit about the people who have DACA right now. So, what are the potential outcomes of a future court decision from the Fifth Circuit on someone's DACA status?
Right. So, for the most part, we're talking about whether people are going to be able to continue renewing or not. Right. So, I mean, obviously, the biggest fear for DACA recipients and pro immigrant advocates is that there could be an injunction that just doesn't allow renewals to happen. Right. Like that is worst case scenario. That is the nightmare. And, folks should be prepared for that possibility. Best case scenario, right, is obviously the program can continue. Texas doesn't have standing. It resolves in favor of DACA and DACA recipients, and the program can continue. Administrations can continue to accept new applications. Um, Today's hearing, I'm a little bit cautiously optimistic that at least the renewals can continue. But honestly, we would just be speculating, right? Because we won't know until a decision is issued. But in the meantime, I mean, we are talking about people's employment and educational opportunities at stake, right? And if DACA does go away, if people aren't able to renew, I mean, they could lose their employment, right? Kristen just described it very, very well about what is at stake here in both personal and economic impact that this can have on families and all of us, our nation as a whole. So for those folks that are still, wondering like, well, what should I do? Obviously, the recommendation is to try to talk to an immigration attorney. If you have DACA and you're able to renew, do not wait. Renew as soon as you can. Also because, I mean, earlier we were talking about how this only impacts the previous state or the previous injunction made it to where initial applications weren't accepted. Well, for people that do have DACA and for whatever reason they let, the DACA lapse for more than a year, that person is not able to submit a renewal application anymore. They are considered to be an initial applicant again. So that person would not be able to renew, right? Even though they did have DACA before. So don't allow yourself to be in that situation. If you are able to and you're eligible to already submit your renewal application, or talk to an attorney, figure out what the best next step is for you and your family.
Thank you, Jessica. And I have a clarifying question for you. So you mentioned of like a decision, right? Like, so a decision is going to impact whether this happens. Do you mean a decision in like this specific hearing? Because I know we didn't get one today for this Fifth Circuit hearing. So do you mean a decision in this Fifth Circuit hearing? Do you mean a decision maybe like more broadly coming from the Supreme Court on DACA or things like that?
Most immediately from this circuit, but obviously as soon as this case is over, it could get appealed immediately to the Supreme Court. It can get remanded. So again, it all depends on what ends up happening once a decision is issued. But yes, immediately, what court decision can affect me? It's going to be the Fifth Circuit's decision.
Gotcha. That's really helpful. Thank you for clarifying that. And my next question is, what happens if DACA is ruled unconstitutional? Are there other options for current DACA recipients now for which to get some form of deferred action or to regularize their status or anything like that?
I mean, deferred action, as Kristin mentioned, has existed even before deferred action for childhood arrivals program was even announced, right? So um, obviously not ideal, right? Because if this program already exists and it's working, then we should definitely, advocate to continue this program since it's working for DACA recipients and our state and our country. But this is why, I mean, every case is so different, right? So this is why we encourage people to talk to an attorney if they're able to try to do their research, to see what options they have. Because immigration law is changing all the time, as evidenced by, the crazy, I guess, procedural history of this case. It changes. So I really recommend that people just try to get that individual support from an attorney if they're able to.
That's incredible. Thank you, Jessica. And I think those are all of the questions that I had, but I'll give you guys maybe a few minutes if you guys have any maybe closing remarks, want to add anything or say anything that maybe I didn't ask. So let's start with Kristin, if you don't mind, Jessica.
Yeah, thanks, Priscilla. I guess just to kind of echo what Jessica had indicated, I think that there were a lot of proponents of DACA and DACA recipients themselves that were very skeptical of being able to prevail in a case at the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit is known for being very conservative and has in the past they've in the past found DACA to be illegal. So I think people walked into this hearing with a lot of skepticism and not high hopes. And I have to say that our oral argument was interesting because I left the hearing thinking quite differently. I think the judges were very skeptical of the state of Texas's arguments. For example, the state of Texas indicated that they would save money if DACA was to be stricken and those DACA recipients were to lose their DACA status, because they make this argument that DACA recipients who cost the state money are likely to return to their countries of origin absent DACA's immigration benefits. The judges were very skeptical of that and asked repeatedly for the state of Texas to cite any evidence they had that would actually result. And they failed. I mean, it was actually quite interesting to see that the judges did not find the state of Texas's arguments persuasive. They appeared to also be very skeptical that a district court judge in Texas would have the ability to impact federal immigration policy across the country, and really expressed some serious concerns about that as well. So I have to say, in closing, I actually have much more hope than I did prior to oral argument, that the Fifth Circuit might actually do the right thing and reverse the lower court's decision and continue to uphold the protections of DACA, at least for those that already have it.
Gotcha. That's really helpful to know, Kristen, right? I think that's a really interesting component that the state of Texas brought up, is that I think they mentioned that there's a high likelihood of self-exile, right? But I think that really we have to like look at things with a certain perspective. Again, these people have built lives here. I mean, even thinking about the campaign says home is here, right? Are they going to return to a country that they've hardly ever lived in, that they don't know anybody? Maybe they don't even speak the language up there. Like, probably not. What's going to happen is that these folks are going to be pushed further into the margins, and are going to start working in underground economies again. And so there will be secondary and tertiary consequences of this, right? And I personally don't think self-exile is going to happen. I think depending on an administration, we can see that if DACA gets overturned, that an administration would even prioritize DACA recipients, right? And so having to be mindful and consider what's within the realm of possibility if that happens. I don't think it's self-exile.
Right. And I think you heard this morning the judges doubt that as well, that somebody who has DACA recipient status revoked is going to self-exile or self-deport to a country that they don't know. They seem to not buy that. So I think Texas was not able to provide any evidence to show that that would happen. And we all know the likelihood of that happening is pretty much zero. So yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Kristen. And I'll pass it off to Jessica. Do you have any last remarks, thoughts you want to impart on our audience?
Yeah, just a reminder that as of today, there's no legal change to the status of DACA since the last court ruling, which again, it's unfortunately no initial DACA applications, but if you do have DACA already, you are able to renew. So again, stressing that for folks that are eligible to renew, make sure you do that, because we don't know what's going to happen with the program. Stay up to date with our social media, our website, txilc.org. We're going to be posting information there in case there is a legal update. If you are a DACA recipient, start exploring other options. Laws change, people's lives change. Try to see if you're eligible for advanced parole. Maybe you have a family member now who can petition for you. There might be an option for you that you might not be aware of. There's the D3 waivers that were also announced during the summer by the Biden administration. Things change. So make sure that you have a chance to explore your options just in anticipation. I started getting involved in the immigration world when DACA was announced, and Kristen mentioning hope. I remember a lot of the excitement, around that. And obviously my job as an attorney right now is to explain what the law is. But I would be remiss if I don't mention the extraordinary advocacy that it took to get DACA started, and for programs like Keeping Families Together that we thought we were going to have a hearing on that today, but we didn't. I'm just, on a personal note, just very inspired by all these different roles that advocates are playing, whether it be organizers or attorneys, doing community work. It's just incredibly inspiring. And again, that's just what keeps the hope, I guess, alive. Same thing, I felt a little bit of cautious optimism about the future of the program. But of course, we need to make sure that whatever happens, we are prepared and exploring our options.
Thank you, Jessica. I think that's such an important note to end on, right? Is that this wave of like activism that is centered around undocumented folks started maybe 15, 20 years ago. this newest wave, I should say, it's kind of always been around, but this newest wave really happened because undocumented folks were putting themselves on the front lines for the Dream Act, for DACA, for DAPA, right? That did get stopped in, I think, 2015, but they have really been leading this movement. And I think this is the appropriate time to say, like, listen to them, right? They have been on the front lines. They will tell you what will happen. And so I think it's perfect time to amplify these directly impacted voices, whether it be DACA recipients, people who had applied for DACA and are now just waiting to see what happens, right? Who haven't received any benefits, family members of DACA recipients, et cetera, right? I think we really need to focus and amplify these voices in these moments of need. But I think that's about it. So thank you, Jessica and Kristin, for your expertise and your time. I really appreciated talking to you guys today. And like Jessica said, we're going to keep posting on our social media channels. So Twitter or X, whatever you prefer to call it, Instagram and Facebook and YouTube. We're going to keep posting updates there. So please stay tuned. Please follow, like, subscribe, do all the things so that you can stay up to date on all of the news that's happening. Because like Jessica said, it's always changing. So thank you all so much for being here with us and for listening to us. And we hope you'll come back soon. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Priscilla.